What's up, guys? Welcome to a special BookBase interview where today I am talking to actor and friend Sal Messina. Today we'll be talking about his story with getting into theater and getting into acting. And the reason we're going to talk to him about that is because we're also going to discuss Hamnet, which is our book or pick of the month for BookBase, as well as an Oscar winner. So I think it'd be a great time to just talk about the movie and talk about the relevance of theater in today's world. But Sal, thank you for talking to us.
Thanks for having me, man.
Dude, of course. So just getting right into it, the first question, I want to talk about your relationship with theater. And I want to start with you just growing up and just watching movies, or were you ever into plays growing up, or what was your childhood like?
You know, it's funny, I wasn't really into a lot of theater growing up, but I definitely was into movies. I think I owe a lot of that to my mother and my grandmother. I remember always going to the theater with them growing up, and that was always such a highlight for me. And, you know, maybe I didn't recognize it at the time of how important that would be later in my life, but, you know, I always enjoyed it. I remember my aunt would host Oscar parties, and I would go when I was 4 years old, and they'd always give me a ballot, and I'd have to like vote on the things. And I didn't really understand what it meant at the time. I just wanted to win,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
You know, I just wanted to win, and I never won because I didn't know like anything about like these movies that were coming out at the time. But like I remember one year, Lincoln was nominated for something, and I was just like, well, I know that he's a president, so I'll just vote for him. And like that won Best Picture, I believe. And so I was like, I was all excited about that. But I always knew I wanted to be in entertainment. You know, I think from a very young age, I always knew that I wanted to entertain people. You know, I grew up with a lot of storytellers in my life, especially from my dad's side. You know, I have 5 uncles and 3 aunts. So anytime at family parties, they were always telling us stories about, you know, them growing up, funny, you know, usually comedic, you know, very funny stories. So I was always just so enraptured by that, and so like interested in like how they structured their stories and like how they made people laugh. And I always loved to make people laugh. So it started out with I wanted to be a comedian. You know, I studied a lot of stand-up. I was really, in like about middle school age era, I was always interested in stand-up comedy, Saturday Night Live. I used to watch a lot of sketch comedy and things like that. And then as soon as I got older, that started to turn into writing. And I was like, okay, maybe I need to write, because they would tell me, like, if you want to be a stand-up, you know, you need to write your own material and things like that. So I was like, okay, I'll start writing. So I started to kind of like write, you know. I didn't really take any classes. I just kind of wrote whatever I thought was funny and on my mind and things like that. And it got to a point where I then was like, okay, maybe I want to direct, actually, because then I started getting more into the serious films and things like that as I grew older. So I started watching a lot of, I think what inspired me for that was Quentin Tarantino. I watched a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies at that time, and I was noticing, oh, he's writing his own movies, you know, that's interesting. And I'm like, and he's directing his own movies, because I remember in some interview, I think he was saying like, I don't like, you know, the writers telling me what I need to do. I want to write my own material and stuff like that and direct my own stories. And I thought that was really inspiring. So I was like, okay. So I started to, you know, look at directing and things like that. I went to Cal State Long Beach for a bit, and then, you know, life happened. I dropped out of Cal State Long Beach. That sucked. But honestly, I think it was something that needed to happen, because what happened next was I went to Golden West College, and they told me, you know, if you want to go into directing, you also have to take acting. It's a requirement. And at the time, this was during COVID-19. Now the pandemic has hit. And I said, okay, whatever, you know, I'll go do this. I don't want to do this, but I'll go do this. And that's where I met my teacher, Marty Ram, who I met first time ever over a Zoom call. And it was me, about like 12 other students, and this teacher. And she, we went this whole semester, and I learned how to monologue. I learned how to memorize lines. You know, I learned all these like little techniques, which was funny. I kind of learned it on my own. And I remember meeting some people in that class, and they told me, they were like, hey, you know, you're pretty good at this. You know, you should continue to like take classes and stuff like that. And I was like, you know, at the time I was going through a lot in my life, and I was like, gosh, this is like the happiest I've been in a really long time, you know, and I was having a lot of fun with this. And so I went for my second semester. By that time, we spent about the first half of it on Zoom, and then the second half, she was able to convince the staff over at Golden West to let us meet up in person. And so I was kind of terrified of that, because I was behind a camera, so I was like in my own little safe space and things like that. But now we spent the second half of the semester on the actual stage, and at first I was terrified, but I started to learn how to do it in person in front of people, and again I fell even more in love with it, and I felt happier, and I was doing all this stuff, and I was meeting these new creative people, and it made me feel good. And so I did that. I did that for a long time. I went through all the acting courses, and I still at that point was like, you know, I think I still want to be a director, you know. So I took my first stage directing class, and by that moment in time, COVID had ended, the pandemic was over, and she was able to put on shows. And so they announced their new season. They were doing this musical called The Drowsy Chaperone. And she was struggling to find the villain for the show. And she comes up to me one day and she goes, "Can you sing?" And I go, "No, I can't sing." She goes, "Can you dance?" And I go, "I mean, like, kinda," you know, like maybe in like a club setting or like in a day, like, yeah, something like that. And she goes, "Okay." And she goes, "Well, I know you can act. Come try out anyways." And I was like, okay. So the night before, I didn't know anything about this musical. Night before, I listened to the whole soundtrack. I found a college production online, watched the whole thing, studied the role that she wanted me to come try out for, and I went and tried out. And I got the part. And about a month and a half later, we performed the show, and it was a life-changing experience for me. You know, it made me so happy to be able to do it. And it changed my life forever, because I then and there decided, you know, oh, I want to be an actor.
Yeah.
I want to be an actor. I want to make people hear these stories, whether it's comedy or drama. You know, I think this is where I belong.
Yeah.
It was like for the first time in my life where I felt clear about what I wanted to do. And I feel like when you achieve that and when you discover that, it's like one of the greatest feelings. Like, it's like a monumental moment in a person's life to be able to discover that. And so since then, I've done so many shows. I've done a lot of comedies, a few dramas, some film stuff, which I'm very proud of, a lot of Shakespeare, which I know we'll be getting into today mainly. So yeah, that's where I'm at now.
Yeah. No, dude, thank you for sharing that. I think it's great hearing you not only find your calling in a sense, you know, as a friend, but also, you know, as someone that's interviewing you, you can hear the passion from someone that's really into the arts and like wants to talk about it. And, you know, it's really cool that your journey, even though it has a lot of ups and downs, you know, it kind of, I like how you said that without you going through some of the down moments, you wouldn't have had appreciation for the moments where you felt that change of emotion. Yeah. And that change led to you realizing like what your passion was and everything. And you have been in a lot of plays. I mean, for those that don't know, he's been in The Drowsy Chaperone like he's talked about, but he's also been in Murder on the Orient Express, The Play That Goes Wrong, 33 Variations, Curtains, Railroad, but he's also been in some Shakespeare plays such as A Midsummer's Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing twice, where he has played different roles each time. You know, I also wanted to ask you this before we get into Shakespeare directly, but what do you think it takes for an actor to fully immerse themselves into the role, and how much do you give yourself into each time that you step on stage and you decide to give everything? Like, what is everything for you when it comes to acting?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has their own methods and ways of getting into character. For me, it's all about research. You know, I do as much research as I can. I like to before I even go and audition for a show, I like to just know the play as well as I can, either by getting a copy of the script or watching a production of it online. And I look for the specific roles that I'm like, oh, okay, I like that role. I think I could see myself in that. I think that's important too, is identifying where you think you can fit yourself in a role. I've seen so many productions in the past where I'm just like, I don't see myself in this.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do something in this, so I'm not really interested in it. But there have been other times where I do see a show that I've never done before, or I know about a show, or I've read about a show that I've never done before, and I'm like, okay, that's now on my bucket list. I want to do this show because there's a character in this show that I think I can do well in performing well and tell that story like efficiently and effectively to this audience. In terms of like, now I've had the role, now I'm getting ready and things like that. For me, it's all about the rehearsal process. I think you discover, for me, I discover it while going through the rehearsal, memorizing the lines, staging it, you know, if it's a role that is kind of a codependent thing where I rely on someone else, you know, I rely on multiple people to help amplify my character and things like that. You know, it's all about that process and how long it takes to be able to do that. It's all about teamwork for me, you know, and for some other things I do is I like to, this new thing that I've started to do is I like to create playlists. Music really helps me get into character. And also when I audition, I pick like a specific song that I think fits the character or fits the play, and I play it over and over and over again to help me get into character, or I'll create a playlist of the character and what I think that character would listen to. And that helps me also, you know, kind of get into the character and things like that.
Yeah, no, thank you for telling me that, and like, or telling us that. And I think that's really cool how you use music to inspire you to, you know, kind of get more immersed in the role.
Yeah.
I do the same thing with interviews. You know, I think whenever you need to get into a specific headspace, music has a really great way of kind of tapping into your psyche and helping you get into whatever you need to get into. And I think it's cool that, you know, you have different processes depending on what stage you are in the acting process.
Yeah.
If you're rehearsing, it's more like do the research, which is like always helpful, right?
And some people have very different ones. Some people will go to a museum and look at art, you know. I knew this one guy, before he would go to do a show, he would do planks. He would get outside, he would stop whatever he's doing in the dressing room getting ready, and he'd go do like 3 sets of planks for like 1 minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just to log.
just to get ready for the show, to get his like headspace into the show and like kind of dissect himself from the character so that he could put all his, you know, immersion into that character.
Right. No, and I think that's really important to see because it shows how serious people still take this, and it kind of delivers this like unspoken vibe where it's like, hey, like, you know, let's give this our all. And it's nice when you're giving everything, you look to the left, you look to your right, you see, you know, fellow co-actors also doing the same thing where they also give everything, and it makes you create like a really beautiful production.
And it's all community.
Yeah, it's all community.
It's all community.
No, I love that. And, you know, I know that, like, you know, the reason I wanted to ask you this question is because, you know, it's really cool to hear how much you love this craft of wanting to act and stuff.
Yeah.
But I know we've also talked about Shakespeare and how your love for acting really dived into your love for Shakespeare as well. And I just wanted to ask you, like, how does this whole process, everything with acting, how did this wrap into your newfound love, or just your love now just for Shakespeare?
Yeah. It's funny because I hated Shakespeare for the longest time when I was a kid. I used to get in fights with my dad about it, actually, because growing up, I had to read Hamlet a lot. I think I had to read Hamlet twice in high school or something like that. And I had no idea what was being said. And I thought to myself, you know, this is stupid. You know, why are we learning about something that we can't even understand what's going on? And I would tell my dad, I'd be like, dude, I hate this guy. I hate Shakespeare. You know, why are we learning about this? This makes no sense. And he would just tell me all the time, like, he's a genius. That's what he would leave it at. Like, he wouldn't even give me evidence of it.
Yeah.
He would just be like, he's a genius. He's like, you just don't know it yet, but he's a genius. And I was like, okay. And I was convinced, like, okay, you're crazy. I'm never gonna, you know, think this. There's no way. During my acting, years when I was just I hadn't performed yet on the stage. It was more just learning and taking acting classes and things like that. Marty had a rule where it gets to a point where so there's acting 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's 2 years of each semester being another level of acting. Once you got to 3, you had to perform a classical monologue. Now that could have been Chekhov, it could have been Mark Twain, or most of the time it was William Shakespeare. And so I had this director come up to me and he said to me, I like your work. Have you ever done Shakespeare before? And immediately my heart sank because I was like, no, and I don't really want to do Shakespeare. And he said, well, I'm going to make you do it.
Oh.
I'm going to force you to do it. This is what you're doing. Because the rule was the directors and actors work together, and if a director chose you, you kind of had to do whatever
Right.
they
like
made
sponsoring
you
in a
do.
way, right?
Yeah, it was kind of like sponsoring. But if they chose you, you had to do whatever they chose for
Right.
you. So he chose me, and he said, you're going to do a Shakespeare. And I went, okay. I can't say no or anything like that. And he gave me a monologue from Othello. It was an Iago monologue. It was a villain monologue. Iago is the villain of Othello, and he is considered by a lot of scholars like Shakespeare's greatest villain. He's very conniving, very scheming, things like that. And so he gave me this monologue, and I went, okay. And like I told you earlier, I did my research. I looked up, okay, what does this even mean? I started there. I said, what does this even mean? Looked it up. And when you look it up, there is this great thing called No Fear Shakespeare, where it will take a section of whatever you're trying to look at, and it will translate it into modern language for you to make you better understand, oh, that's what these guys are saying.
Got it.
And so I looked that up and I was like, okay, now that I understand what this guy's talking about, I can start to look at each sentence and put it into my own acting and behavior and things like that. So I did that, and one thing led to another, and I went, okay, now that I understand that, now let's look at the context of the play. What's even happening in this scene? Who is this guy? Why does he hate Othello so much? And I looked into it, and that whole thing was basically he is jealous of Othello because, well, number one, he was a black man, and Iago was inherently a racist guy who hated to see a black man in that position of power. Secondly, there was a rumor going around that Othello was sleeping with Iago's wife.
Got it.
And Iago, not really thinking about it, was turned into this jealous rage. I think the line is beware the green-eyed monster being jealousy. That's one of the main central themes of that play is jealousy. And so he was just so obsessed with getting revenge on Othello for something that wasn't even true. And so I learned all of that, and we started rehearsing, and I asked my director questions, and he would provide what he knew. And one thing led to another, and I finally got to perform it. And I performed it in front of my students and everything like that. And they were I remember that class being so uncomfortable by the end of it, in a good way, of course.
Yeah.
Uncomfortable, scared, nervous, things like that. And kind of like how I said with Drowsy Chaperone, where I kind of felt like that kind of moment of realization, it was the same thing with this, where I performed that monologue and I was like, oh, this was powerful. This was hard hitting.
Yeah.
This really got to people. And they didn't really understand what I was saying, but it still made them feel a certain way. And I was like, wow, okay. Maybe I am starting to kind of like this. I don't think I'm going to do it again, though.
Yeah.
But then Marty decided to do Midsummer Night's Dream. And I had done Drowsy Chaperone, but I wasn't a musical theater actor. I was a play actor. So I was like, okay, this is a director I really like. she's doing a play. It's Shakespeare, but now I kind of know how to do my research on Shakespeare and things like that. So I looked up Midsummer Night's Dream. I looked up a production on YouTube, and I watched it all the way through. And I remember really loving the character Nick Bottom, because I thought he was really funny. I thought he was really goofy. And I thought, okay, I think with my acting style, I can put on this performance. And one thing led to another, and I got the role. And I was able to perform the play, and I loved every moment of it.
Yeah.
That cast, that story, that character. He's still one of my favorite performances I've ever done, ever done, is playing him, because it's, you know, he just had such a golden heart, and the great thing about Shakespeare is, you know, with other shows, you kind of have to, you know, really be, what's the word I'm looking for? Realistic. Realism. There's a lot of realism with modern contemporary plays and stuff like that. And you should do that with Shakespeare too, but there is also a bit of a big abundance of emotion that you want to show on stage, because you're acting in front of people that don't understand what you're saying.
Right.
So you have to show that emotion in order to get people to understand what you're talking about. And I really just always love that about whenever I perform Shakespeare. But anyways, yeah, I mean, that's where I kind of found my love for Shakespeare, was doing Midsummer Night's Dream and performing that monologue.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's something that needs to be said, because I grew up also not liking Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It was outdated. It was really hard for me to understand.
Yeah.
And like what you're saying about acting, you know, when you're reading Shakespeare's plays, you don't get that context,
Yeah.
right? It's just raw. Like the words are just what they are, and your job is like, and that's what English class was about. It was annotating and learning.
Well, I think it's just the problem with American education, at least with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking at it as literature instead of looking at it as performance. You know, these are plays.
That's a really great way to put it. Yeah.
These are plays, you know, and that's how they should be. You know, you can do that in class, and I think it's important that you do that in class. But if you're going to do it in class, you know, assign students roles.
Right.
Okay, you're going to play Hamlet. You're going to play Horatio. You're going to play King Claudius. You're playing Gertrude. Things like that. It's like, I think it immerses young people into that world, and it gives them a better understanding of what this guy was trying to tell people.
Right, right. I think the one thing about Shakespeare that I'm starting to pick up now is that, like, when you first read about Shakespeare, you feel like he's like an outlier in this old world where his stories are more of fantasy than it is of realism. But then when you start watching, I know we're going to talk about this later, but like movies like Hamnet, or like you start looking at professional plays where you see an actor give that tonality, you start realizing that like these plays aren't really fantasy at all. They're based off of real ideas.
It's real people.
Like jealousy is real.
Jealousy is real.
Envy is real. Anger is real. Making mistakes, they're real. And I think Shakespeare, like, he's not a storyteller in the sense where he's making up these magical realms. He's a great storyteller because he's talking about real life things, but he's wrapping it up in a way where it's easier for you to digest it without you kind of seeing it as like, oh, like this guy's jealous, you know, like, or like how anybody would spread gossip. It's not gossip. It's a story about this guy that's doing really well, and you're another character like Iago, where it's like you're looking at him and you're like, dude, like this guy has it all, and now he's talking to my wife. Like, I'm mad. You know, I don't think that, like, you know, it is like the situation of like like what you were saying, a black man in power and stuff. These are pretty radical ideas for the time.
Radical.
And like, exactly, and that's why Shakespeare is also so interesting, is because,
And that's why we're still talking about him today.
Still talking about him, right? Like, he was
400 years later.
400 years later.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. You know, what was he doing that other people weren't? It was creating real situations using elements that people wouldn't really talk about, right? He used racism as an element of jealousy. People don't really see that. They just saw racism and like, oh, this person's doing better than me. Like, where is he from? What is he doing? But Shakespeare was able to add layers to that and make you kind of understand if you're really feeling something, it's not because this guy's in power. There's something deeper than that. It's inferiority. It's like, you know, this jealous complex system where it's like, dude, like, I just don't like this person doing better than
I mean,
me
just on Othello alone,
Yeah.
I mean, uh, Iago, that whole thing of jealousy, it stemmed from something that wasn't even true.
Yeah.
Gossip got to him, and that's why that whole conflict is happening, because people were gossiping for something that wasn't even true. Rumors were spreading. And that's so relevant today. That still happens today all the time with everyone. Everyone goes through that, where rumors get to someone and either not even true, but some people just decide to believe it, and it drives them to a dark place in their lives.
Yeah. I mean, in your opinion, like, what are some of your favorite Shakespearean plays that kind of really resonate with you when you do think about stuff like, you know,
I mean, well, like you mentioned earlier, I did 2 versions of Much Ado About Nothing, and it is a comedy. It's a lighthearted comedy, but it has a lot of powerful messages. One of them being the character Beatrice. She is a strong feminist character that doesn't fall for any man. She makes fun of men a lot. And she is a very independent person, a very independent thinking woman. And at the time that was written, it's like no one was writing about that. No one was talking about those things. So that in itself is crazy. Another thing from that play was the idea of sexual love versus romantic love. With the character Claudio and Hero, they kind of knew each other, but not that well. But they're like, okay, let's just go get married. I'm sure this will work out. And that's, are they doing it for this, because, for sexual love or romantic love?
Yeah.
While Beatrice and Benedict, they fight each other, but they love each other by the end of it because of who they are. Because they like their personalities, not just because of they think they're attracted to one another. Yeah. Hamlet's another one. Suicide, mental illness, to be or not to be, that is the question, It's you hear that monologue all the time because it's just so important. Yeah. It's so important to know about. Macbeth, power, what power does to someone. Right. What the obsession of power does to someone. Paranoia. Like being so paranoid, being so guilty that you committed this heinous act. For those that might not know, what Macbeth does is he kills the King of Scotland to be able to be the King of Scotland. Yeah. And because he commits this act, and because he is influenced by his wife, Lady Macbeth, to do it, he then falls into this deep state of paranoia, and he starts killing his friends, his advisors, things like that. He goes to war. All just because he's so paranoid that people are going to find out that he committed this horrible thing. And because all he wanted was power. And it's crazy. Trying to think of something else. I think that's about it. Those are some of my favorites, Yeah,
thank you so much for sharing that. And you see some of these stories and it's sometimes jarring to realize, like what you were saying, how similar these stories are to today's time. There's such universal lessons, such universal stories, which I think also helps understand why Shakespeare is so relevant. Yeah. You can't kill the King of Scotland today, but it's like you also know what it's like to want that position of power and to let...
But you also just see how that position of power corrupts people.
Corrupts you. And we see it today. We see it in so many ways.
Absolutely. Another one that I just recently discovered, I don't know if you've seen this clip, but Ian McKellen was on Stephen Colbert's show recently. And Ian McKellen, before he was Gandalf, before he was Magneto, he was a Shakespearean actor. He's a huge Shakespearean actor. He still performs it today. Right. And he's part of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he's been doing it. He's dedicated almost his whole entire life to it. But there's a play called Sir Thomas More, which was not written by Shakespeare, but Shakespeare used to collaborate with other playwrights at the time and create these, plays and stuff like that. And Shakespeare wrote one scene for the play, and it's about this lawyer named Thomas More, and he's a lawyer from England, and the story is about these rioters who are upset about immigrants coming into England and wanting to kick these people out. Right. And this whole monologue that Ian McKellen does talks about how this lawyer talks to these people, these rioters, trying to get these immigrants out and telling them, they're just people.
Yeah.
What if you were in their position?
Right.
What if you tried to go to France or Portugal or Spain or something like that with your babies on your backs? And you've gone through all this time and hard work to try and get there, and then you get treated poorly by these people.
Yeah.
And then I think by the end of it, I forget what the line is. It's like, this is the stranger's case, the strangers being the immigrants, and this is your mountainish inhumanity.
Yeah.
You guys are being inhuman. You guys are not being kind to these people. You don't know what these people are going through.
Right.
And he wrote that 400 years ago. And then look at where we're at right now.
Yeah, just seeing how things are, and the inability to sometimes put yourself in another person's shoes is very alarming. And I think I've heard this before, where it's like, to read is to be empathetic, because when you're reading, you're putting yourself into another person's shoes.
Yeah.
But if you take that a one step further, I would say to write also requires an extreme amount of empathy, because to write a character that has opposite numbers of like motivations and like opposite levels of logic and how they go about things.
Yeah.
If you want to write about an immigration story, you have to understand immigration. You have to be in the shoes of immigrants to understand, well, what would an immigrant really want in a country where they're arriving to? What are the conflicts that they would have to go around? How do they deal with that? And I think that's, something really special about Shakespeare, is that his emotional intelligence is something that I feel like we study specific people from these times that are definitely able to really communicate that. But Shakespeare really had that level of like tapping in emotionally to some things that people wouldn't even bother with. And I think we see that in the movie Hamnet. We see, even though it's not written by Shakespeare, the story's written by Maggie O'Farrell, amazing author, but like, what is the story about? I mean, it's about Shakespeare essentially living life with a certain level of looking at the world compared to other people didn't. And that's essentially what attracts him to Agnes, which is like his wife, another person that's able to see things differently than him. Yeah. And we have these two loners that eventually, unite because of their ability to see one another while other people wouldn't.
Yeah.
And, going into that, what you think about the movie?
It's great.
Yeah. What'd you
like fantastic.
About it?
I think it was the best movie of the year. Yeah. I mean, man, I was sobbing by the end of it, because, it's highly speculated, that he wrote this play because he had a son who did exist named Hamnet, who died very, very young in his life. And it's said by scholars, and it's said at the beginning of the movie, that the names Hamnet and Hamlet are interchangeable with one another. And so when you take that story and just that idea that a grieving father who is an artist decides to immortalize his son through his artwork, it's just a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful message. And I think it's just an overall, it's really a great example of what we as artists do.
Yeah.
And, we take those tragic moments in our life, and, it's part of our therapy, is being able to express our, grievances and our desires with other people in the forms of plays, art, music, movies, things like that. There's a lot of scholars that don't think that he wrote Hamlet for his son. That argument being that he wrote it about 4 years later after his son died, and there were about 10 other plays created at that point. But I don't know, my argument with that is, it takes time to grieve.
Right.
It takes time to grieve, and maybe at the time he didn't think it was appropriate to write a play.
Yeah, and the movie does a great job at kind of like illustrating just the emotional depth that I'm sure comes out of wanting to create something out of the passing of your child. I think Paul Mescal did a great job just acting him, not because of like him being a great actor, of course, but it's also like he played the role perfectly because he did play someone that struggled with the idea that he understood something about the world that other people weren't entertaining. Like when you watch the movie, one of the best scenes that I like is the time where he yells back at his dad for hitting him, for not doing the gloving stuff right. You know, you do that back in the day, you get kicked out. You get kicked out, you get shunned on, you're the family weirdo, like nobody's gonna talk to you. Why? Because you had a perfect trade that would have given you consistent money and you dropped that. Why? Because you felt like he was belittling you. But the dad didn't understand that his heart wasn't going towards these trades, it was towards something else. And at the time, Shakespeare himself didn't even understand it, right? In the story, and like I know we've read the book and we've watched the movie, you know, when he's trying to figure out himself, it's not like, hey, I'm Shakespeare, I'm a poet, I'm a writer, this is who I am. It's that he's a loner, he's not being understood, and he happens to write little excerpts on pieces of paper, like in the movie how it shows. And then these pieces of paper, you put it together, oh shit, it happens to be a story. And like what I also like about the movie is that as he interacts with with Agnes, as he interacts with his family, he still writes. And it shows that he's translating his own experience into his writing. And I think that whether you're, you know, I think any scholar would agree with that's how Shakespeare had to operate, because you don't create these types of stories unless you experience some element of it somewhere in life, right? Like, is Shakespeare an immigrant? Do you have to be an immigrant to write a story like Sir Thomas More to work with somebody? I don't think so. But do you live in a country where you probably do see immigrants around you and seeing how the social, you know, hierarchy is being like kind of being turned upside down because of seeing how these political things are happening? Yeah, that makes
But I
sense.
mean, he also traveled.
He also traveled.
He traveled the world.
Yeah.
He visited Italy a lot.
Yeah.
And who knows how the Italians treated him while he was there.
Right. Absolutely.
You know? And I think he visited Spain too. Like, you know, he traveled Europe.
You see
so
it.
He saw it.
Yeah.
He saw it all the time. And also, he was a poor man. He wasn't. He learned a lot of his stuff on his own.
Yeah.
So when he started making his plays, and releasing them to the public and things like that, all these other college educated, because he wasn't college educated,
Right.
but all the university educated, but all these other guys were. So all these other guys were like, you know, everyone was going to see his plays. They weren't seeing the university educated plays.
Yeah.
And these university guys were like, what the fuck? Who is this? You
Right.
know, who's
Right.
this guy? You know, he comes from a cobbler.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, he grew up poor. His dad was in debt
Right.
from the church. You know, he struggled.
Yeah. Yeah.
He struggled.
I think that's why Hamnet, I think, was such an important movie for us when we were watching, is because like as people that are also trying to be creatives, also trying to make our own mark and stuff, you know, we see a prime example of someone that is known to be a legend for 400 years of just doing amazing things. Where does he start? Even though it's a fictional account, like it's historical fiction, we don't know the details exactly of how Hamlet was created. The idea of someone that is kind of isolated meets someone that's also isolated, finds beauty in that. You have a child because of that. You love him to death because you just think that he's going to be something amazing. You're teaching him the trades that you've learned, and through such a hardship, he passes away at a young age and you're left with this emptiness. And I think it's so beautiful yet saddening that, you know, for Shakespeare, maybe one of those theaters in writing this play was because he was mourning so much, he had to turn that in the best way that he could have, which was using creativity as an outlet to kind of communicate these moments of grieving and these moments of sadness. And you get one of the best plays of all time, arguably, right? People always argue that Hamlet is one of Shakespeare's like magnum opus.
People will say just straight out that it is the best.
Yeah.
It is his best.
Right.
People say that it's one of the best pieces of fiction ever
Yeah.
written. People say that people will claim that he's the greatest author that ever lived.
Yeah.
And you know, you can argue it, but you also have to understand where these people are coming from, because there is evidence to support those claims. I think he created about 1,700 English language words that we use today, which is insane.
Insane. The homie's a dictionary.
Insane.
Yeah, the
he
guy's a
created
dictionary.
he helped create modern language.
Yeah.
But he also created these stories that are heavily influenced today. You know, I think one that we always look at in terms of, we're talking about Hamlet, we look at The Lion King. Mm-hmm. We look at The Lion King all the time. The Lion King is heavily inspired by Hamlet. to bring up a more modern one, the new Dune trailer just came out, Part 3 coming soon. That's Macbeth.
Yeah.
A lot of that is Macbeth. The Star Wars prequels, that's Macbeth as well.
Yeah.
There are a lot of movies that have come out that are straight up just modern interpretations of Shakespeare. The movie Nobody Wants This, Nobody But You, I think is what it's called. I forget what it's called. We'll figure it out in post. But it's Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell. That's Much Ado About Nothing. It's straight up just Much Ado About Nothing. There's a movie called 10 Things I Hate About You, or She's the Man. She's the Man is Twelfth Night.
Yeah.
You know? So you can't deny that this guy has impacted our lives, will continue to impact our lives as soon as we're gone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people are still going to be, Hamnet is not the last movie you're going to see about this guy.
Right.
You know what I mean? We're going to continue to see so much about him, and it's important because of his relevance, of his impact, and also his mystery.
Yeah.
You know?
What do you think is important about highlighting that, the mystery and the significance and the relevance of Shakespeare, especially in today's time?
What do you mean?
Like, I feel like people say, like, Shakespeare is 400 years old, like, these are great stories and stuff, but in your opinion, like, what do you think is important about movies like Hamnet, or like, further adaptations of old works from Shakespeare that people could argue is outdated, but for you as an actor that immerses yourself in this world, like, what is important about you wanting to look for plays like this, or look for works that are Shakespearean?
The feeling. I think Paul Mescal said this in an interview. He said it to Chloe Zhao, because Chloe Zhao, when she was making the movie, she didn't understand the text of Hamlet. And Paul Mescal told her, it's not about what you understand, it's about what you feel. And I think that's so important. Because every time I've gone up and done a Shakespeare, and every time I will continue to go up and do a Shakespeare, it makes you feel a certain way that not a lot of other pieces of work, specifically in plays or in movies, will make you feel. And that comes from both the actors and I think the audience members as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's another reason as to why we still talk about him today, is because he made you feel, and still continues to make you feel, in a way that not a lot of other pieces of work or other things in general will make you feel.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's really important. I think that's really, honestly, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think when you do, at some extent, when you do start like diving into Shakespeare's works and stuff, I think you do feel seen. I think you read some of these plays that were made so long ago, and then you're like, what the heck? Like, you guys are fighting the same things that we're fighting today. History does repeat itself. And when you read the creative works of Shakespeare, I feel like you kind of have this element of like, dang, like, you guys were really talking about it back then too. And it's more of like it's paying homage to a revolutionary in his own way, where he saw something that was happening in society, and instead of creating work or just doing something that was typical of that time, he decided to criticize it and decided to kind of, hypothesize like ideas of what could happen if you live in a society where you take an element of society like power control fights. What happens if you take it to an extreme? You do look at things like murder. You do look at things like espionage and like betrayal. And what happens if you don't have something, somebody else has it? You get into things like jealousy, envy. You start looking at things like paranoia. You start looking at things like hate. And it's important to go over things like this, because it's kind of like a warning system that I feel like Shakespeare's works have now created for us, where it's like, as a society, I feel like it's good to go over Shakespeare, because you're going to look at markers in society where you kind of start understanding, wait a minute, you're kind of going down a trope that has already been talked about, so it's easier to identify. Now, when you see a king, quote unquote, go a little bit too crazy with power, now you think of Macbeth. Why do you think of Macbeth? Because now you see what happens when power goes a little bit too much.
It's crazy. As soon as you're exposed to him, you really do notice things in life. In just life, not even on plays or storytelling, which you do in those too, but just in life, like, you'll start to see it and you'll be like, wow, yeah, you know what? I remember. This is kind of like the same thing
Yeah.
as what he said in this exact scene in King Henry or something like
Right.
that, you know?
Right.
And it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's insane. You know, and I think also that's why it's great that people take these works and they do different versions of them.
Yeah.
And that's another beauty of it, is people like recently someone took Romeo and Juliet and made it a Western. Made it set in the West. Why? I don't know, but it worked.
Yeah.
I did Much Ado About Nothing where we played Vikings. Why? I don't know,
But it worked.
but it worked.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think that's how universal his work is, right? Is that you do have even that creativity inside of the project where you can choose to adapt it any way you want. Like you do get the Lion Kings, the Star Wars, and even from there you get even more niche conversations of like, you know, like Romeo and Juliet. I remember as a kid, right? Like it's just funny adaptations, but it does go over these universal themes of love and the emotional spectrum of the human being,
Right.
and how we look at the world, and that's important to understand, which is why we follow the arts.
It's people making it more palatable for people who, I mean, especially I think young people who are afraid of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Because I still think that is a thing, especially in America where we live, of people are afraid of Shakespeare. You know, it takes people a long time to be able to be like, appreciate what he's doing.
And, you know, just approaching our final question, like, how do you think we can fight that fear of Shakespeare? Or, you know, I know you mentioned that website, No Fear of Shakespeare and stuff like that, but besides like maybe tools that you've used in your own process, you know, what do you think is something that for those that are watching could like be like, hey, you know what, this is a good takeaway to take on like why, you know, we shouldn't be as scared when approaching ancient, or not even ancient, but older text like Shakespearean plays.
Yeah. Again, No Fear of Shakespeare. It's a whole collection of all of them that you can just read, clearly understand, just from a literature perspective of what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
Do that. Go see performances. If you just sit down and watch the performance, you'll, you might not understand everything that's being said, but you'll at least get context of what's happening.
Yeah.
You know, especially if the players will perform it effectively, then you know you're gonna be able to understand it better. We mentioned earlier, I think American education can be better about teaching it to young people. You know, I don't think it needs to be as scary as they make it out to be sometimes. You know, that's not a diss on teachers, but I just think we need to recontextualize how we approach him.
Yeah.
And just make more things like the book Hamnet, make more movies like Hamnet, make more things that are about this guy, make more movies about the actual works. You know, I know Denzel Washington just made a Macbeth recently that was pretty good. You know, make more little fun movies like Romeo and Juliet, or movies like the Glenn Powell, Sydney Sweeney movie, or, you know, She's the Man, things like that, you know?
Yeah.
You know, don't be afraid to, you know, make those things.
Yeah, no. Don't be afraid to express yourself.
Don't be afraid, yeah.
Yeah, don't be afraid to dive into these texts. They're there for a reason. I think, you know, school may be a little bit harder to contextualize things, but I think your idea of performing them instead of reading them is so important. I think creating, you know, more books and more plays off of the idea of Shakespeare and his work and his relevance, I think will always be something that can, I think that'll always be something that will be important for people to always study. And I know that'll always be relevant in our society, but, you know, I just want to say, Sal, thank you so much for sitting down with us to talk about theater, to talk about your own story for those that might want to pursue acting or the arts and stuff. We love hearing your story about how it did come with its own trials and tribulations, but you fought them and you're in a place of just more sense of, you know, you're more self-aware about what you enjoy. You're more self-aware when you're in moments of happiness, like when you act. You know, thank Chloe Zhao for making Hamnet. You know,
and Maggie O'Farrell
for writing it. It was amazing. Like, it was just such a great experience to read the book, watch the movie, and just sit there after the movie with you and just looking at the credits like, oh, we really saw something.
Yeah.
You know, so thank you for sharing that. And like, yeah, if you guys want to check out Sal's journey as he goes about his acting journey, please follow him on Instagram at Salvatore_J_Messina. We'll put in the description of the interview, but that will be it for today.
I actually
Thanks,
have
guys.
one more thing
Oh,
I'd
yeah,
like to
yeah.
say really quick to both you and Elias, because I know you guys put a lot of hard work into this and what you guys do, and I just wanted to say thank you both for interviewing me today.
Oh,
you know?
dude, yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
And I want to just say I just wanted to quote Shakespeare himself to both of you guys, because I think it's important, and to anyone that watches this, because I think it's important. This quote comes from Hamlet, and it's said by King Claudius himself, which is funny because he's the villain of the book, but he says, and what Shakespeare says is, "To thine own self be true."
Just being true to yourself.
Be
right?
true to
Just
yourself.
making sure that you're
And
able.
what you guys are doing is being true to yourself.
Dude.
And I appreciate you guys for that.
Wow, Sal, that really means a lot. Thank you so much.
So, and to anyone out there that's struggling to figure out who they want to be, to thine own self be true.
We'll end it there. Thanks, guys.
Hi, my name is Salvatore Messina. I'm a working actor trying to make his way in the world. If you want to continue our discussion on Hamnet, you can do it on BookBase. Thank you so much.